May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be aligned with your love, O God, our strength, our courage, and our freedom. Amen. Should the threat of dire predictions cause us to withdraw in pain and fear? For those of you who believe that God has created a universe in which there is a deep interconnectivity of all things and all persons, it will not surprise you that there now has developed a deep physical connection between us here at All Saints Church and the Ebola crisis in Sierra Leone and Liberia, or at least one physical connection of which I'm aware. There may be many others. Just 3 Sundays ago, during the 9 o'clock Eucharist, I was serving communion right here, when I looked up in surprise that a 25-year-old man I've known since he was 6 years old, Cameron Nutt, was kneeling for communion with some members of his family. I met Cameron and his family when I moved here 19 years ago. Now he has given his life over to providing global health care with his boss, Dr. Paul Farmer of the organization Partners in Health. Dr. Farmer is known as the man who would cure the world, as described in the best-selling book Mountains Beyond Mountains by Tracy Kidder about Dr. Farmer. Cameron, our All Saints parishioner, lives in Boston where he works. He has a degree in global public health and is preparing to enter the Harvard Medical School. At the communion rail last Sunday, Cameron's mother whispered to me, "Can you stay afterward and bless Cameron? He's about to go to Sierra Leone and Liberia." I had one of those knowings that I should bless Cameron there and then. And so I put my hand on his head, pulled him into my chest, and prayed a blessing for him. I later learned that Zelda Kennedy had also blessed him as they were leaving the door after the service. When I checked my email later in the day, I had an explanatory email from Cameron that he had written me from the airport going back to Boston that Sunday night. He wrote, "Several weeks ago, our organization unanimously decided to get engaged in responding to the Ebola crisis in West Africa. And we've been preparing rapidly ever since. As my mom mentioned briefly this morning, I'll be traveling with Dr. Farmer to Liberia and Sierra Leone on Tuesday for meetings with both countries' presidents, the ministries of health, and the United Nations offices to help map out the immediate next phases of the response. As a non-clinician, I'm serving in a policy support role to advance our partnership with local health authorities and the sadly very small number of other organizations trying to do something on the scale that is needed, and will have no contact with patients myself. Right after we're there to set up what we're going to do, then dozens and later hundreds of doctors and nurses will be following us to set up and staff a number of Ebola treatment center units that are required to save lives, stop transmission, and end one of the worst public health crises in recent memory." Then he goes on to talk about his work, and he notes that even before the outbreak, Liberia has had less than 50 doctors to care for more than 4 million souls in the wake of long civil wars. One of the most painful things about this disease, he said, is it preferentially targets those who give care, family members seeking to comfort their sick loved ones, health workers poorly equipped to safely and effectively treat the patients they've sworn to try to heal, and every day, good Samaritans who refuse to just walk past a neighbor dying in the street. The few hospitals that are there are completely full, and patients are literally dying outside the locked gates of these facilities every day. Then Cameron explained the relational turmoil he was in and why he wanted some blessing. His closest friends were beginning to face stigma and discrimination at their work because of Cameron's plans to go to Sierra Leone and Liberia. You get it? Despite the fact, he says, that we will be rigorously following every safety and screening guideline from the Centers for Disease Control and the World Health Organizations, he had friends whose family members wanted them to stay away from Cameron after he returns. So Cameron was feeling existentially torn. He continued in his email to me last Sunday night, "Our efforts are to treat our global neighbors as we would want ourselves or our own families to be treated. We live in one world," he wrote, "not three. As the virus that so clearly doesn't respect national borders is showing us every day. Despite the fact that the resources needed to address its impact among the poorest and most vulnerable are so often stuck at customs. Yet despite clarity about what needs to be done, I find myself facing a moral and spiritual test in terms of how to respond, how to balance my responsibilities, to be a thoughtful and loving friend to my close friends, and how to tap the strength needed to offer pragmatic solidarity to our colleagues on the front lines and to many patients and would-be patients." So he closed his email to me. "Thank you with all of my soul for any guidance or counsel that you might be able to offer in helping me to engage this journey from the frame of big mind," which was the topic of the sermon 3 weeks ago. To be a big mind, to have big mind, not small mind in our religion and in our living. To open my heart to God's voice with each step along the way. With much love and gratitude, Cameron. Here's somebody who grew up in this church. 5 and 6 years old when I met him. Do you have that sense of the kind of radical revolutionary stuff we are planting in the minds of young people so that 20 and 30 years from now, they'll be solving the world's problems that we can't even imagine this morning in 2014? So I called Cameron and talked with him before he left, assured him of our prayers, our solidarity. And then yesterday, after getting word that he was back safely, I talked with him again on the phone, got his permission to preach about him this morning. He's safely back in Boston. He said that he's not in any quote-unquote known exposure category. He's self-monitoring his temperature for 21 days. And that he saw his trip, his 2-week trip, as an opportunity for the United States as a country to decide to live in the global community. And then he quoted back to me the message that you and I try to give one another all the time. He said, "The U.S. has an opportunity as a country to live in the house of love instead of the house of fear. And the answers to this crisis need to come from the house of love, because only love can enable us to embrace complexity." Now, I wanted to share this ongoing story of Cameron with you all because this morning's lesson from Jesus is not a lesson about taxation. Some slimy, sleazy religious and political leaders came up to Jesus trying to entrap him with a question about taxes so that they could catch him saying something bad about the empire, and that could feed their desire to put him in jail and put him on a cross. But Jesus, who really is crafty, responds in a deliberatively enigmatic way in order to avoid this trap, and also by giving us a question that Cameron Nutt was struggling with before he went to Sierra Leone and Liberia, to give us a question that Jesus himself dealt with every day of his life, and that we are called to deal with every day of our lives. And that question is, whose are we? Whose fingerprints are on our actions and decisions? Do you and I belong to Caesar or the empire? And the empire can be anything from the empire of racism, economic disparity, economic injustice, homophobia, any imperial thing that keeps us from understanding whose we are. Do we belong to Caesar, the empires, or do you and I belong to God? And does everything about us belong to God? See, that was the question Cameron had to answer before going to Sierra Leone and to Liberia. And he answered it, I think, as soon as he had the following revolutionary, life-changing, kingdom-oriented, gospel-oriented, Jesus-oriented thought. Our efforts are to treat our global neighbors as we would want ourselves or our own families to be treated. We live in one world, not three. Richard Rohr has written that Jesus the Christ revealed what he calls the unitive mystery. Now, I read that, I had a glory attack. Unitive mystery. The unitive mystery of divine love. That is, that God's love is not about just saving a few and dealing primarily with sin and judging who's in or who's out because what they've done. But God's love, the unitive mystery of divine love, is about making the whole earth new, the whole creation new, redeeming the entire cosmos. You see, if your religion divides people, your religion's too small. If your God divides people, your God is too small. If your God parcels people up and parcels up divinity, it's too small. And in order for God to make the whole creation new, each of us needs to do our part in remembering whose we are. I just learned that Mark Twain said that the two most important dates in your life are, one, the day you were born, and second, the day you discover why you were born. It's not that simple, Brother Mark Twain, because human beings are intrinsically forgetful, and we have to be reminded over and over and over again why we were born. You see, that's why we come to this table week in and week out, to have our amnesia reversed. Do this in order to remember me. Richard Rohr says that when he stands at the Eucharistic table, that he oftentimes says that God has an easier time convincing bread and wine who they are than convincing you and me who we are. The bread and the wine are God's love to nourish us and everybody on the planet. And our job is to be God and nourish everybody on the planet. Our friend Tom Shaw died this past week. Tom died at age 69 of a brain tumor. He was the leader of our monastic order, the Society of St. John the Evangelist, in Boston. And later he was the Bishop of Massachusetts until he resigned 2 years ago. He was the functional godfather of my son, Peter, and prayed for him every day. In a 2004 interview, Tom Shaw, may he rest in peace, said, "We are what God has to do good in the world. Every one of us has a voice, and every one of us can make a difference if we exercise that voice." He went on to say, "I don't think that on most civil rights issues, for instance, we can point to one huge event that's changed everything. I think instead it's thousands of ordinary people doing what they think is right, taking risks, speaking out in their lives in big ways and small ways. And eventually that is what turns the tide. God really depends on us for that." My brothers and sisters, God is depending on you and me to turn the tide, not just for our tribe, not just for our country, not just for Christians, not just for Episcopalians, my Lord, but for everybody. The whole planet. And the way we can do that is to discover whose fingerprints are on us. Discover whose we are. Because that is true salvation. Discovering whose you are. Amen.